Hey everyone, welcome back. I know this is a little different for everyone, but we'll do the best we can as long as we're doing this. But I do want to say that I miss you all. Hopefully, we can be back together soon. But in the meantime, I guess this is how we'll be learning, where I can post some lectures and figure out some other stuff all through Google Classroom. So I would say make sure that you're on Google, make sure that you turn your notifications on, and if you know a friend who maybe does not have the code, I'll post that again for you and you can share it with them. But you definitely need to be on Google Classroom over the next few weeks as we're doing all of this. Um, and by all means, email me questions, post questions, and while we're all stuck at home, I'm more than available to comment or answer any questions that you guys have. Um, Getting things started with World War II. We were somewhat introducing this before you left. If you remember that video that we watched the day before, you probably don't remember that video we watched the day before, but it was kind of over the two intersecting themes in the 1920s and 1930s, one of which was all about intervening. This one is not going to win out. And if you think about our theme of intervention, there was a plan at the end of World War I for collective security. There was a plan at the end of World War I for all of the world to get together and try to maintain peace. There's one president who you'd need to associate with this theme, and I know what you're thinking, Woodrow Wilson. So just kind of understand that this entire idea of collective security, Wilsonianism, intervention with the League of Nations, it doesn't work. There is, however, the constant of dollar diplomacy and business interests abroad. And even with Wilson, even with normalcy in the 1920s, we are basically intervening continually throughout Latin America. So there is this theme of intervention, but do kind of understand that the whole European side of things dies out with normalcy in the 1920s. Yet there is the constant of dollar diplomacy and business interests, especially in the Caribbean. Sound effects. I don't know if you heard it. But interventionism will clash with this one, which is going to win, disarmament. And I'm thinking you vaguely recall some of this from before break. This is our dominant theme. This is the way that we're going in the 1920s and 30s, where we want to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. And we go as far as banning war. If you do vaguely recall the Kellogg-Briand Pact, that's in the 1920s, where we outright ban war. So the clear theme of isolation, the anti-war movement, and the political party that was really against any type of international involvement, it was definitely the conservative Republicans. If you're thinking League of Nations, remember Article X, it was the conservative Republicans that hated that the most. Therefore, we never got in the League of Nations, and Europe is going to get ugly throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Meanwhile, we were dealing with a Great Depression. So just kind of think this is our transition to foreign policy, which will lead us to World War II. Looking at this interesting political cartoon, you can see it's by Dr. Seuss. The caption says, "Ho hum, no chance of contagion," which is slightly ironic with the times we're in right now. Uncle Sam is saying, "What a lucky thing we've got separate beds," but he does not have the appropriate social distancing from the Stalin itch or Hitleritis. It looks like he is going to get infected with whatever these guys are carrying. So Dr. Seuss, you'll see, was an advocate for intervention. He is poking fun of our isolation. He's poking fun of the fact that we're ignoring all of this bad stuff that's going on in Europe. Dr. Seuss would actually want us to be involved over there. You'll see a lot of this guy's cartoons as we go. All right, quick review. You guys should remember some of this stuff, nothing to really note here, other than the fact that we're isolating ourselves to the extreme throughout the 1920s. We sold our warships in World War I, we scaled back our military, and we have all of these things preventing an arms buildup. But if you recall, there was a loophole in these 5-power, 9-power treaties where small warships could be built. And from the US, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, a couple of these countries are going to exploit the isolation and disarmament, and they're actually going to start to expand, notably Japan and also Italy. So you'll see Japanese expansion while we are disarming and kind of ignoring the rest of the world. In terms of Japanese expansion, they invade China. And I think world history taught you a little bit about the nasty stuff they do in China. You probably vaguely recall the rape of Nanking. But if you rewind all the way to their first attack in China, they invade Manchuria. And we set this entire precedent of having a very, very weak response to it all. We passed the Stimson Doctrine. The Stimson Doctrine simply says that we're not going to recognize your territory if you take it by force. That's a little weak. We're not going to recognize your territory. Does Japan care if we recognize their territory? No. So we're essentially giving them a free pass to expand wherever and however they want. A lot of historians have called this Stimson Doctrine a paper bullet because it doesn't really do too much. And this Japanese expansion will shoot right through our paper bullets because the Stimson Doctrine is kind of weak and definitely ineffective. As for FDR, we do change things up a little bit in Latin America. Remember his cousin, big stick diplomacy, and then there's dollar diplomacy and moral diplomacy. All of that called for near constant intervention in the Caribbean. FDR actually changes that a little bit, and he wants a friendly relationship with Latin America. For example, when Mexico nationalized the oil, we let them do it. What would Teddy Roosevelt have done? What would Taft have done? They would have intervened. They would have kept that American oil in American hands. But we were dealing with the Depression. We didn't want a war with our neighbors. So FDR enacts this good neighbor policy, which does work well throughout his administration. In the 1950s, this will change up a little bit and we'll be intervening here constantly yet again. But just understand FDR, good neighbor policy, it works while he's president. And we're not going to intervene. We're not going to occupy. We're not going to practice dollar diplomacy while he's president. Okay, a little bit more pre-World War II United States. Dictators are rising up throughout Europe. You probably remember Mussolini or maybe Stalin, or you definitely know Hitler rises up in 1933. Do we do anything about this? No, we're essentially retreating to isolationism, burying our head in the sand, and keep in mind that we've got the protection of, the Kellogg-Briand Treaty. We banned war, so surely none of these evil dictators are going to do anything. We banned war. Oh yeah, that's not going to work, by the way. This one is important. I mentioned this Nye committee right after I taught World War I, where I said we start to go isolationist, and they fear that our weapons makers and our bankers got us into World War I. So they want to prevent us from selling any weapon to a country at war. As a result of this Congressional Nye Committee, we pass a series of neutrality acts. And these neutrality acts are not going to allow us to trade with any country at war. So if our friends in Europe are at war, if they're losing at war, the neutrality acts handcuff us and they don't allow us to sell any weapons to these countries at war. And again, we did this because we were kind of thinking that business wants war, business makes more money selling weapons to other countries at war. So slightly complicated with this, but definitely important. We also have the America First Committee. And this America First Committee is going to have probably the most famous American as their spokesperson. If you remember this guy from the 1920s, he flew across the Atlantic. He came back to a hero's welcome, a ticker tape parade in New York City. Charles Lindbergh was probably the most famous American. In the 1930s, he was in charge of the America First Committee. What is it? Simply put, they want to put America first. They don't want any European involvement. So the America First will be organized, vocal, powerful, and they'll have the very strong leader of Charles Lindbergh in charge, not wanting American involvement overseas. In addition, Spain, Well, they've got a revolution going on. You've got a fascist takeover from our, say, democratic friends in Spain. Are we going to help out our democratic friends in Spain? No, we let this guy take over. So Francisco Franco is a fascist who takes over, overthrowing the Republican government of Spain. Why don't we do anything? Well, it's the 1930s. We're in a depression. We can't help our friends because of the Neutrality Acts. Despite that, about 3,000 Americans did volunteer to actually go over there and fight. They were the famed Abraham Lincoln Brigade. But nonetheless, Spain collapses and it goes fascist under Franco for quite some time. So again, Spain's collapse shows our isolation, shows the fact that we're not going to help out, even if it's our democratic friends who are going to lose this thing. Here's a famed political cartoon, again by Dr. Seuss, showing that, well, we can help win the war, but the Neutrality Acts are going to prevent our aid that will win the war. It's not even going to allow them to go over to Europe. So Neutrality Acts are going to be a major, major obstacle for FDR to get around when we eventually do want to help our friends in Europe. Few of the big names. I think world history would have taught you at least a brief bio of these guys. Benito Mussolini takes over in the 1920s in Italy. He starts to expand throughout northern Africa. Stalin, he consolidates power by essentially killing his opposition, and he becomes kind of our awkward ally in World War II because Stalin will be fighting against, of course, Hitler. So just understand that you got a few big names in Europe, more on these guys as we continue, but I'm hoping that world history has provided at least a little bit of background on these guys for you. We'll definitely discuss them further as we go forward in World War II. All right, big term, appeasement. Appeasement will be giving in to demands to avoid a conflict. And if you think about this, the majority of Europe wants to avoid conflict. World War I was devastating. World War I, extreme loss of life, bankrupts nations. So nobody really wants another world war, especially so close to the end of World War I. So as Hitler, as Mussolini, as these guys are going on the offensive, the rest of Europe is going to give in to their demands. They are going to appease Hitler. Just think of it as like giving in to the bully every single day as he's taking your lunch money. You just give him your lunch money because you don't want to get beat up. So there are a lot of examples of it. Appeasement, Europe does it, and we even do it as well as other countries are kind of pushing us around. We're just going to give in. Now, Japan, again, they invade Manchuria. And here's the interesting thing. As soon as they do invade, as soon as they're going very aggressive with their expansion, Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to call everyone out. He said we need to quarantine the aggressors. He said that the United States needs to step up its international role, and we need to quarantine all these aggressors and essentially do something. Now, it's notable that this quarantine speech was met with fierce opposition because the United States did not want to be involved in Europe. So FDR, he's a bit of an internationalist. He does want to quarantine the aggressors, but the United States does not want to do it. If I think I did this right, I tried to include a few hyperlinks for you, just brief Wikipedia bios on some of these that might clarify it. But again, understand that FDR wants to be involved. He makes this speech, then the rest of America freaks out because they don't want to be involved in Europe or Japan or anywhere else. Now, this one's fascinating. Japan sunk an American ship. Americans die. What do? Do we go to war? Americans just died. Japan, Japanese expansion, Japanese aggression, just attacked an American ship. What would Teddy Roosevelt have done? Think about the Jingos in the 1890s with Japan attacking an American ship. What would those Jingos have done? Well, they would have gone to war. Instead, we just asked for an apology. Japan did apologize. We accept the apology, and we essentially appeased, Japan and their expansion to avoid a conflict with them. We don't want to fight. The rest of Europe doesn't want to fight either. Nazi Germany, if you recall, that Treaty of Versailles prevented them from having a military. They couldn't rearm. They couldn't do all sorts of things. Basically, Hitler ignores it, and nobody does anything about it. They don't want to confront him. They're going to appease all of these, demands that Hitler starts to make. And once Hitler sees that nobody's doing anything about the ignoring of the Treaty of Versailles, he then forces the German people into military service. He invades the neighboring Rhineland, territory that was taken away at the end of World War I. Great Britain and France do nothing. So Hitler's, again, got a free pass. He then annexes all of Austria by force. What's the rest of the world do? Nothing. Classic examples of appeasement, and Hitler's not stopping here. He then takes the Sudetenland, and this one actually sparked a little bit of an international crisis where the British leader, if you recall any of this from world history or that video that I did show you the day before spring break, the British leader is this guy, Neville Chamberlain, who is like the epitome of an appeaser. He ends up like going to a big old conference. He ends up meeting with Hitler, and he comes back to Britain with this piece of paper with Hitler's signature, and he says, "Oh, I have Hitler's signature, and I guarantee that by giving him Sudetenland, we'll have peace in our time." Yeah, that doesn't work. They don't get peace in their time. In fact, Hitler basically realizes that everyone's weak. So shortly after the seizure of the Sudetenland, he's going to invade Poland and then officially kickstart World War II. So we're going through the late 1930s here, 1936. This is 1938. This is also 1938. And again, that Munich conference, just think of this as like the epitome of appeasement. They give in to Hitler's demand. They give him the Sudetenland. Neville Chamberlain's like, "Oh, I got peace in our time." Yeah, no, you didn't, Neville. So Neville Chamberlain will soon be replaced by a much more assertive British leader. And I think you have heard of Winston Churchill. So Churchill is going to really step up and replace Neville Chamberlain after this thing is a miserable failure. So I know a lot of background here. A lot of this, by the way, is world history. I just think we need that foundation of appeasement because we're doing it as well. And we're essentially witnessing Europe collapse, and we're not doing too much about this. Another Dr. Seuss cartoon. Remember, one more lollipop, then you can all go home. Here's the appeaser with only 4 lollipops. Yet that evil Nazi sea monster, I don't think will stop after it gets those lollipops. Dr. Seuss is critical of the policy of appeasement, without a doubt. Here's another one. Why might this not be effective? So he's underwater, evil Nazi weird thing. Does playing a violin work underwater? It's probably not going to appease him. Probably going to have a tasty lunch with that weird looking character. Anyway, what are we doing at home? Well, we want to ban war even more. In fact, we want a constitutional amendment that would say if Congress wants to declare war, then the American people get to vote on it to just approve the whole thing. By the way, this doesn't pass, but it was really, really close to passing. So it's a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would mean if Congress exercises its war powers, then it goes out to a national vote. And if and only if the American people approve of this declaration of war, then we go to war. So it's highlighting the fact that we are definitely isolationist and we don't want war at any cost. It doesn't pass, but it was really, really close to passing. Louis Ludlow, the famed Ludlow Amendment. This one kind of highlights the path of aggression of both Italy. You can see Italy invades Ethiopia. They'll then take out most of North Africa. And you can see Germany's expansion here, where Germany, if you follow the numbers, they'll occupy the Rhineland, some of the territory that was taken away at the end of World War I. They'll then annex all of Austria. They'll then take the Sudetenland. And the next step, of course, in 1939, when they invade Poland, that will officially kickstart World War II. So World War II in Europe will begin right here with the invasion of Poland. So we'll kind of continue that other stuff as we go. What are we doing about all of this? Nothing. We're kind of going America first, still dealing with the problems of the Great Depression. So we are essentially ignoring all of this chaos that's developing with the Axis expansion. And check out how quickly and how much territory the Nazis will get. This is by 1942. It's like, whoa, what happened to France? They have everything. The only holdout was Great Britain here. So the Nazi expansion, with us not doing anything about it, it was vast. You got the Soviets kind of holding the line over here, and then the British, they're the only ally that we have left that's holding on. And the Nazis will be bombing Britain daily with a so-called Blitz that you might remember from world history. So just a few details on World War II, and then we'll kind of wrap things up with our first lecture. This is like, I would describe it as the German manifest destiny. It was the belief that Lebensraum, that they need living space. They need vast living space for all of their people. So just if you think of Lebensraum like German manifest destiny, that's how they rationalize taking all of this territory, and they keep wanting more and more and more and more and more. And they believe that it's God that wants them to have all of that territory. There again, 1939, the official start date of World War II. In terms of the style of fighting, remember how the Nazis are modernizing their military, ignoring the Treaty of Versailles, building up their military, calling up the troops, new submarines, new planes, new tanks. What's the rest of the world doing? They're disarming. So by 1939, Hitler has this lightning fast warfare, and that's what blitzkrieg essentially means, lightning warfare. In part, they're fighting guys on horseback because no one had modernized their military. So they're able to take all that territory so quickly because no one else was modernizing. They were, in fact, getting rid of their military. So blitzkrieg in Poland. This is what we eventually do about this. When we recognize that Europe is collapsing, especially our friends, the French, when they collapse, we enact something called cash and carry. And the thing to understand about cash and carry, it's a loophole in the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Act said that we could not trade with a country at war. FDR eventually gets this thing passed where it says, okay, European friends, if you come over and pay cash and then bring it back yourselves, then we'll sell you some more materials. So it's a temporary way to really keep Britain alive. Cash and carry, it's a loophole in the Neutrality Acts. Well, France eventually falls by 1940. Have you guys seen the movie Dunkirk? There was a miraculous evacuation of some 300,000 Allied troops across the English Channel. If you haven't seen the movie Dunkirk, I do highly recommend it. But Hitler could have wiped out everyone there. So Dunkirk will be the miraculous evacuation of the rest of the Allied troops in Great Britain. And from that point forward, the Nazis are going to be bombing Britain on a daily basis. London will be bombed. People are in the subways seeking protection. But France falls quickly. And again, tapping into your world history knowledge, do you at all remember France's main defense against the Germans? They built a big old wall, or a Maginot Line, as it was called. Think of like this heavily fortified wall with guns pointing at Germany. Yeah, that didn't work. The Nazis simply went around the wall and took out France within a couple months. So Europe is falling quickly, as you see. They're bombing southern Britain. This is in 1940. Britain, London, that's on fire. Winston Churchill is the new British Prime Minister, who I'll try to bring some video clips in for you as well, but he's going to keep morale high. He goes on the radio, and he is really charismatic when he speaks. He says, we will defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We will fight on the beaches, fight on the landing ground. We will never surrender. So he is essentially able to keep the morale high, and they are the last holdout. And what are we doing? We're kind of helping. We're doing the whole cash and carry deal. So we're kind of helping out at this point. So we're aware, we're fearful, especially after France falls. In fact, when France falls, we do something we've never done before, and we have our first peacetime draft in all of American history. So it's in 1940. We're still not at war, but we do our peacetime draft. We call up the troops and we start to get ready for this thing right after France falls in 1940. So we're, again, not directly involved, but once it's getting ugly in Europe, we're starting to become a little bit more aware of this whole thing. Well, Britain's struggling more and more. So we do a destroyers for bases deal. Um, some said that FDR would be in violation of the Constitution by doing this. He would be exercising more power than any president had had. He gives some old destroyers, some leftover stuff we had from World War One. He gives it to the Brits in exchange for naval access at other bases. So we're keeping them alive some way, somehow. That's what the destroyers for bases deal does. But it does make a few people question the power of the president in this time of war. Britain gets 50 destroyers, U.S. 8 bases. So it was front headlines of the paper. But you can see the dominant theme: national defense at any expense, but keep our boys at home. America First Committee. Keep U.S. out of the war, be neutral. So there is still this dominant sentiment to be out of the war, to stay neutral, to stay isolated. Yet we are, kind of helping, is the way that I would explain it. Woodrow Wilson, the ghost of Woodrow Wilson, kind of looking over FDR, signing this U.S. neutrality deal. Hope you have better luck than I did. Remember, he's trying to run for re-election in 1916 with a campaign pledge: he kept us out of the war. FDR is essentially doing the same thing, trying to stay out of the war, but we're gradually getting pulled into this thing. There's a weird looking Winston holding the line. Winston Churchill as the British Bulldog. And again, I'll try to figure out how to post some video clips for you to highlight this thing as well. So a lot of history that I'm going over. It's a lot of foundation. A lot of it is, world history based, but you need to understand our role in all of this is neutral, isolated, but slowly we're becoming aware. Slowly we're going to get pulled into this thing. There you go. A lot of people seeking safety in the subway, air raid shelters. And let's close with another election. So FDR, he had won in 1932, won again in 1936. Can you serve another one? Yes, he does, and he wins. And he's actually going to win again in 1944. There's no law, there's no amendment against that. Interesting in that he is campaigning, saying your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. Sure enough, that's all going to change by 1941. Similar to what Woodrow Wilson did in 1916. He kept us out of the war. By 1917, we were in. He ends up beating this guy, Wendell Willkie. I'm really not too concerned about you noting Wendell Willkie's name, but FDR will win again in 1940. There's the Republican opposition, Wendell Willkie. And that should be a pretty good place for us to wrap things up today. I'll try to supplement this with maybe closing questions, maybe some discussion-based questions that I can post on Classroom. And Quizlet is still there. I'll give you a link to that. And by all means, ask me questions. If you just want to comment on this thing and, ask some kind of clarifying point, I will definitely help you out. So, good place to end today with this re-election, third term. Let's kind of wrap things up there. And let's see how I stop this. Stop sharing.